and welcome to The Art of Being Human. We're still dealing with suicide, although this may possibly be the last segment on suicide because we're coming to the end of what I want to say. And after this, we'll be starting drug addiction. I think we'll spend this segment and the next segment on suicide and bullying, and then after that we'll be getting into drug use, because drug use causes a lot of suicide as well, and the drug scene is terrible. There's more and more people using, and so we need to get into that as well. So for general information, suicide is high among alcoholics, drug abusers, homosexuals, the elderly, and some healthcare workers. Why those groups? In fact, psychiatrists have a pretty high rate of suicide as well. So you could consider them maybe a healthcare worker. Now, alcoholics and drug abuse, it's self-destructive behavior. In and of itself, it's self-destructive behavior. And so there are some people that consider it to be suicidal behavior, because the likelihood is, if you can't lick it, you could possibly die from it. And can you call that suicide, or is it not suicide? Is it just death by drug use or death due to alcoholism, or is it a suicidal thing? Now, maybe the two are combined. Maybe sometimes, I'm not sure. I don't think that everybody that starts drinking or starts using drugs wants to kill themselves. I think they want to escape. I think they want to escape into something that's better. They want to live a life which is not so stressful. They want to feel better about themselves. Maybe they're having physical pain and they want relief from the pain, and they're not getting it from the kinds of drugs that they're using, or it's not as effective as it needs to be. And so I think when they start with another purpose in mind. I don't think many of them would want to commit suicide. If they wanted to commit suicide, there would be other ways of doing it that would be a lot faster. But when people get into using drugs, and alcohol as well, it changes the structure of the brain. When you first start using, this feels good, this feels great. I had a few hours of relaxation, I didn't feel my anxiety, and now I'm back and I'm pretty much the same as I was before. I don't see any change in me, and so it looks like a temporary escape from whatever it is you're trying to escape from. But as you continue to use it, it stops being a temporary escape, and it starts to actually change the brain structure. And when it changes the brain structure, then your brain demands that you have it, and you can't get out of it. You will do anything in order to get that drug, in order to get that high. And it takes more and more to do it. And if you don't do it, you get sicker and sicker because you've got all the withdrawal symptoms. And so it's just like a cycle. You start it for one purpose, but then the end is not the same as the beginning. The end is the fact that, well, I can't take this anymore. I have to have the drug. If I don't have the drug, then I can't live. I become much too sick, and I've got to have the drug. So therefore, the drug now controls you. You don't control when you take the drug for recreational purposes, but now the drug controls you. And that's the way it is. And it's very, very unfortunate because people get into the drug scene without ever realizing that they're being entrapped. If you've seen the spider and the fly, I used that example before. If you've seen a fly get into a spider's web, they try to get out, and they're flailing and all of this, and the little legs are moving, and the wings are moving, and they're getting nowhere fast. They're just getting deeper into the net, the spider's net. And of course they're going to die there. There's just no way for them to get out. You need to have help. If you're stuck in something like that, you need to have professional help to get out. Very, very few people can do it on their own. I know there are a few that have, but they do suffer. And then even when they're off the drugs and they're not using them, they still want the drug. They still haven't completed the healing process. They're still working at it. When you're recovering from a drug, you're always recovering from the drug. And so you still have the wish to have the drug, you still have psychological problems that are caused by using it, and all of that needs to be addressed in terms of having professional help. You really need to get professional help and not try to do it. So alcoholics and drug abusers, they are self-destructive, but I don't think that they intend to commit suicide until in the process when they realize they can't get off the drug. Then I think there's a chance that they can become suicidal because they see no way out. And then at that point, they may start having some suicide ideology. They start to think about suicide. Well, how can I do it? And how much better would life be if I wasn't here? How much better would life be for my family if I wasn't here? But the problem is suicide always causes a lot more problems than it solves. It really doesn't solve anything. It just adds to the problems that already existed before, except you're not there to deal with it. So it's high. It's homosexuals, they had a very high suicide rate. It may not be so high now because society seems to be more in touch with them than they were before, but it was really high. The elderly become suicidal because of health problems, disabilities. A lot of their friends have gone, you know, and they don't have many people left. Their families may be gone. And so they have a problem. And then, of course, healthcare workers see all of this, and it's very traumatic for a healthcare worker to deal with people who are going to die or who are very ill. It affects them emotionally. You know, you can't continually see people and work with people and then see them pass on, because no matter how well you work with them and how much relief you can give them, at some point, they're not going to make it. And so that just gets in the craw of many healthcare workers, and they sometimes become suicidal themselves. But we've always said that people who commit suicide or who want to commit suicide leave some clues. They kind of communicate that that's where they're at. And they don't sometimes even realize that they're at that point. They sometimes get angry when people catch on to the fact that they're thinking about suicide because they didn't realize they said anything that would open it up, that another person would be able to catch on to it. So the question is, why do suicide people communicate anyway? Why do they want to have people know? Well, a good portion of them don't want people to know, and they try to keep it secret. And a lot of times when a person commits suicide, everybody's blindsided. They didn't see it coming. It happened out of the blue. We didn't see that this was going to occur. And then they feel guilty because they didn't pick up on it. But some people do pick up on it, and this is what you look for. Sometimes they communicate because they haven't really made a decision to do it. They're leaning toward it, but they want confirmation from other people that this is an okay thing to do. It's never an okay thing to do, but they want to get some kind of a feeling as to where other people are on it. They haven't made the decision, and in a way, they're hopeful that someone's going to intervene. Hopeful that someone's going to say, don't do it, I'll help you, what can I do to make things better? And that's a great relief to them. If you think a person is anxious to commit suicide, that they want to do it, that they're thinking about it, always ask, because it doesn't force them their hand, it doesn't make them do it. If anything, it'll help to stop them. And they have a great relief that they're sharing a secret that was a secret, and now someone can step in and help them. The ball can get rolling to help them with whatever it is that they're dealing with that would cause them to want to commit suicide to begin with. So they're not really sure that they want to do it, and they haven't quite made the decision. But some people use suicide as a manipulation. They want something, they're not going to get it, they think they're not going to get it, so they threaten suicide. And then people rush around them to do whatever they can to make them comfortable, and they end up by getting what it is that they wanted, and the suicide threat stops. That's pure manipulation. And you should not give in to manipulation, because that only teaches people to manipulate more. Anytime they want something, it's back to the suicide story again. And after a while, it's like they speak too much of it. And when they speak too much of it, people stop paying attention. You know, it's a person that cries wolf too many times, and after a while people just turn away from it because they've heard it too many times before and they don't trust it anymore. When a person first says, oh, I'm going to commit suicide if I don't get this, or if this doesn't change, if it's a family matter, people try to accommodate them and then they get what they want. But if they keep at it over and over again, a person may really be suicidal, but the family says, we've heard all this before. This is what they do. This is their coping skill. This is how they manipulate us into what they want. And so they leave the person alone and they don't look into it because they think it's just another thing. You know, it's just another attempt to manipulate. And then the person turns out to be suicidal and sometimes makes a successful attempt. So sometimes it is a manipulation. Sometimes people communicate because they want them to know, because they want to prepare them for their death. You know, they actually hint around, and you can't miss it when they do something like that. It's like, you'd be better off without me. I know that life would be better for you if I wasn't here. I won't be here much longer. I'm thinking about making some major changes in my life. And they kind of hint around at it because they want people to know, wanting to prepare them for the death, especially their family members. When they say they're not going to be there, well, how come? Well, I'm going to carry a gun with me in case the temptation gets to be too great, or something like that. You can't miss something like that. That's a direct clue that they're going to do it, or that they're thinking about doing it. But they want to prepare others for their death so it doesn't come as such a shock to them. I don't care how much you prepare. Suicide is going to be a shock. It's going to be a terrible shock. And so it's something that you have to consider what's going to happen to the family members. If a person does it, what happens to the rest of the family? The grief is almost unbearable because the guilt is almost unbearable. And there is still quite a stigma about a person who commits suicide. And the family bears that stigma. Why didn't you do better by that person that died? Why didn't you see it coming? Why didn't you intervene when maybe they just didn't know? So they sometimes do it to prepare others for their death. Sometimes they do it to change things. And if they threaten suicide, people will finally listen to what they've been trying to say all along that people haven't listened to. So that's a part of it too. And some people do communicate without even knowing that they're doing it. And for them, it's a surprise that people actually know. Even though they've been hinting around and hinting around, they think they've been so subtle that people haven't picked up on it, but that people do pick up on it, and then they're surprised by that. Sometimes angry at that because they didn't want them to know. Sometimes angry because their families found out. They wanted to keep it a secret. Now, suicide has become epidemic. There is so much of it, and there is such a thing as suicide clustering. Now, in suicide clustering, you have a group of people who decide to commit suicide at the same time. They all do it together. And that, I think, romanticizes it, although there's nothing romantic about it at all. It's really a grisly thing. But people sometimes will do it with other people. And there have been various times in history where you have outbreaks of suicidal behavior that's clustering, where several people do it at the same time for whatever purpose. They want to make a statement or something. But the problem with making a statement with suicide is nobody remembers the statement. You know, it's like children. If a parent screams at a child, not to do this, not to do that, and they scream over and over again, the child doesn't hear what the parent has to say. He hears the screaming. He's frightened by the screaming. He's reacting to the screaming. But in all of that screaming, the message gets lost. So how do you talk to a child? Well, you take him to one side and you talk to him calmly and rationally. Then they get the message. If you're yelling at them, they don't get the message. They only get the fact that you're upset and you're angry and you're screaming. But what you're screaming about doesn't really register with a child. And so it's the same kind of thing. For suicidal people, you can talk and talk and talk. After a while, it doesn't make much sense. So some people do it together, and they cluster together, and they commit suicide together. And for them, it's a statement. But people, what are they going to remember from that? They're not going to remember the statement. They're going to remember that there was a group of people that committed suicide. And the message of that gets lost somehow and doesn't get retained by the people who find the bodies. They're shocked and they're disheartened and they're upset about what they have found. They have found the bodies of these people, you know, but they're not actually going to learn anything from it. They're not actually going to take away a message because the message gets lost in the drama of the moment. And that's what happens. The drama of the moment is what gets the attention. And sometimes you get boyfriends and girlfriends, and they get together and they commit suicide together because one doesn't want to be without the other. I had a personal experience when one of my cousins committed suicide, and she committed suicide with her boyfriend. And they went out in a car, and it was a carbon monoxide suicide. They made a suicide pact, evidently, and they both committed suicide at the same time in the car with carbon monoxide poisoning. Nobody knew where they were, and nobody knew why they did it. And at first, I didn't even realize that my cousin was involved. It was all over the news. And then as I tracked it down more, I understood that it was my cousin, who was the girl who committed suicide with her boyfriend in a car on a mountain. So no one could find them. No one would be hunting for them on the mountain. No one would realize that's where they would be. And they killed themselves that way. So that does make an impact. It does really make an impact on a family, on a society. But what was the message? Whatever the message was, it was lost. Or it may have been they were both feeling in despair about something. I don't know what it was, but they must have, because if they hadn't felt in despair about something, they wouldn't have committed suicide. If things had been going their way, they wouldn't have committed suicide. So they had to be distressed about something. But as I've said before, being distressed over something doesn't necessarily mean that you're mentally ill. It means that you're distressed over something. We become distressed over all kinds of things in our lives, and that doesn't mean that we're mentally ill. Now, some people who commit suicide are mentally ill. There's no question about that. But most mentally ill people are not violent. They're just not. So a lot of the people who commit suicide, it's a rational decision. They did it for a purpose. They did it because they had a meaning they were trying to transmit, or a decision they wanted to make in terms of their own health or their own living circumstances or whatever. But it doesn't necessarily make them mentally ill. Now, teenage suicides, the aftermath is important to look at. Teens have a terrible grief reaction to the suicidal death of a friend. And a lot of it centers around guilt. Why didn't they come to me? I would have taken care of them. I would have stayed with them. I would have taken them to a doctor. I would have taken them to the emergency room or the hospital. But they never came to me. I never knew. And so it's not unusual for a person to be shocked by the fact that one of their closest friends committed suicide and they didn't know. They didn't see the clues. They didn't see the communication. Maybe the person was successful in keeping it secret because they didn't want anyone else to know. Or perhaps it was something else. Perhaps there were little clues here and there, but they were missed somehow because no one knew what to look for. No one knew what the clues were. So what would the clues be? Well, a direct clue would be, I'm going to kill myself, but that's unusual for a person to come right out and say it, but some people do. But little comments, I'm going to be gone in a few weeks, and you're not going to see me for quite a while. You'd be better off without me. I think that the family members have had enough of my behavior. I may take a little vacation and leave. All kinds of clues, all kinds of statements about, I'm going to be gone. You'd be better off without me. I'm not going to be here is basically the message. So how are they not going to be there? They're going to kill themselves, although they don't really come out and say so. But there are other things besides that, starting to give things away that are important to them because they want to make sure the things that they love have a good home. So they start giving things away. They make a will if they haven't had one, and they become very precise about what they do so that everything gets covered. All of the financial and the legal aspects are taken care of before the death, so that therefore it's all taken care of and there's not so much of a mess left behind. But you can't get rid of the guilt or the loneliness or the psychic pain that people feel when they've lost somebody that way. It is not a normal death, and people do not have a normal grief. They have a very intense, complicated grief as a result of somebody killing themselves. So the grief reaction of a teenager to another teenager's loss through suicide is a very hard thing to go through. And teenagers should be allowed to be with their friends for mutual support. They should be allowed to attend the funeral with each other because of mutual support. And how the media reports it makes a big difference. If the media reports suicide as the awful thing that it turns out to be, then they're not so apt to commit. But when the media starts to romanticize it, by romanticizing it, I mean things like, well, you know, they did it all together, and somehow they make it a good or more positive thing than it needs to be because it's not a positive thing, then that romanticizes it. Well, think of the thing, we all die together. Isn't that glorious? Well, it isn't glorious for the family members or anyone who's left. But when it gets romanticized, then people do it because they don't think of it as being as the awfulness that results from the suicide on family members. They just don't think of it. And the family members are left wondering, what did we do wrong? Maybe they didn't do anything wrong. But if they did miss the cues, I mean, I don't think missing a cue it makes a person at fault or guilty in any way or sense at all. But the thing is, if you can catch the clues and act on them, then you can help to preserve a life. But there are times when you just don't know, and you shouldn't feel guilty if you don't know. You can't be judged for what you don't know. If you knew something and you didn't do anything to help, then there is a certain judgment that comes with that. Or if you wanted a person to kill themselves and if you encourage them to do it, there's a certain guilt that comes on with that. There's a girl that was sent to prison, I think in California, fairly recently. She talked her boyfriend, into killing himself. He had reservations at the last minute. He didn't want to do it. And she talked to him and practically demanded that he do it. And he went back and he did it. And she was considered liable for that because she didn't stop it. She encouraged it, and she has a prison sentence. She will be in prison for a few years because of that. I don't know how long the sentence is. If a person is a healthcare worker and they know that their patient is suicidal and they don't report it, they're legally liable for that. You have to be legally liable. Doctors who give medications have to be very careful with depressed people because if they're giving a medication, the patient may just save up the pills and not use them and take them all at once and commit suicide that way. So a psychiatrist or a doctor giving medication has to be very careful how they do it. They have to be sure that the person's not going to overuse. I've had psychiatrist friends of mine who will give one pill a day to a patient, and the patient has to go to the office every day to get that medication, so that they know they can't overuse it or save it for a later time. Now, I saw, and now I'll close with this because we are getting low on time, but when I was studying as a graduate student, we had a person come in to talk to us about her upcoming death. She was dying of cancer, had a fair amount of pain, and she says, my lumps have lumps, my growths have growths. And what she did, she took a pillowcase and she stuffed it with pills. And when she went to the doctor, when she went to the hospital for her final days, she had that pillow with her. And she said if she just wanted to commit suicide, all she had to do was dig into that pillow, and she had all the pills she would need in order to commit suicide. Now, as it turned out, she did not commit suicide. She died a natural death, and they found the pillow stuffed with pills in case she wanted to use it to hasten her death and to make sure that she died maybe on her own terms. Whatever her reasons were, she might want to just decide just not to go through that whole process of death. And you know what's interesting is the fact most seriously ill patients that are facing death do not commit suicide. Most of them do not. They would be the ones that you would expect that would want to do it, but they don't. They go through the death in a natural way. So very rarely do you have a person commit suicide because they are at the point of death. They just don't do it. They talk about it maybe sometimes, but usually they don't do it. It's other people who would have a longer lifespan to live, and they cut their lifespan shorter by taking pills or whatever they're doing in order to kill themselves. But it turns out they could have lived considerably longer and fairly comfortably. So, it's not necessarily a reasonable thing. Well, we're running out of time, so I'm going to close it here, and we'll continue with this next time. Please join me then.